I'd like to know about your next adventure.
Yeah. Oh yeah. So I'm not doing any big sailing adventures anytime soon. That is, you know, for me, I'm looking for more adventures. Obviously I'm actually working as on a sailboat right now, which is fun. I'm doing, day cruises and sunset sailing cruises, which is enough to scratch that itch. Um, but my next adventure is hopefully going to be next summer. That I'm going to be hiking Olympic National Park
Nice.
um, with my dad and my siblings. And hopefully this will also be my second film that I'll be doing. And the reason we're going to Olympic National Park is back in 1982, my dad spent a summer with the Student Conservation Association working and doing trail maintenance there. And next year is 40 years since then. And during that summer, even, my dad's a professional photographer now. He still was doing photography back in the late 70s and early 80s. And so he still has the original slides, the original negatives from that summer.
Oh, wow.
And we're going to go back and recreate frame for frame these photos, particularly with me and my environmental background and his environmental background and all this, is to photograph how the glaciers have changed in the 40 years. And so we've got the route planned of the trails that he used to help maintain back then. And we're going to hike the trails, and we're going to try and bring in the Student Conservation Association, and also go and hit all of the places that he went to that are still around. Go to the cafes, the restaurants, the outfitters. There is even a family friends that he stayed with back in 1982 that still live in that same house.
That's cool.
So we're gonna go see them.
Cool.
And so I'm super excited. It is my first time to the Pacific Northwest. And it's a place that I've really wanted to visit for a long time, if not consider living. So that is something I'm super excited for, but that will hopefully be next July.
That's beautiful. Yeah.
What's next for this project, the next phase?
Yeah, so there's kind of two major parts of the outreach side of it, of doing lots of talks and communication side. So, doing these kinds of interviews with you guys, and also doing more outreach events with other organizations like North Carolina Museum of Natural Science. I'll hopefully be doing a talk with them in October, and I'm also giving a talk at the North Carolina the Environmental Educators North Carolina. I'm speaking at their conference next month. So there's that big part of getting out and just telling my story, to one, show to the people that have been a part of this project and been supporting this project of like, hey, this is the things that I've done and these are the things that I've accomplished, and I want to share my story, but also use this opportunity to speak to people of all backgrounds and help inspire them to go and do their own adventure and pursue their own projects, to show that you don't have to be super experienced in what you're doing. You don't have to have all the gear. You don't have to have all the answers. All you have to start, you just have to have a good idea and a passion. And once you have that, you can then translate that into action through, your passion and the people around you. And it all just starts with having an idea and just to run with that idea. And I hope that my trip and my adventures can help inspire someone else to go off and do their own.
That's cool.
But that's kind of one phase, and the other phase is eventually trying to get this this documentary together. So I've got all my it's a lot of work, but I've got all my footage now, and so now it's gonna the next phase of the footage side is finishing the YouTube series of the actual, kind of the adventure side, as well as then starting the documentary side of starting to piece together of like, all right, what is the story that, there's so many different avenues I could go, but trying to narrow down, looking through all the footage, what is the story? What is the arc that I am the main character that is then touched by all these later interviews, to then have this ultimate conclusion at the end? Because it's just like with any story, you need to introduce a main character, have them go through this arc, and have them be different in some way at the end. And so trying to figure out how to tell that narrative through this adventure and storytelling along the way. hopefully next summer.
Do you
Okay.
have any advice for anyone else planning a long distance trip in a small vessel?
Yeah, I would say some of the definitely things I would like to keep in mind for people is anything that you think is small will feel a lot smaller by the end. And that plan for anything to break. And that I always, particularly on a small vessel, and this, I think this really goes for any vessel, is never expect people to help you. Now it's always amazing for people to, reach out like you guys did to me. But I never planned to, within my itinerary, within my, supplies, I never expected anything out of anyone. And so plan accordingly. And particularly for a solo trip is always keep reserves. Don't stretch yourself thin. It's better to end up with surplus at the end than to find yourself strapped with nothing out in the middle of nowhere. And also, the last thing that I always like to tell people is acknowledge your mental health. That doing a big trip is incredibly taxing on your mental health, both good and bad. But I think that going on a big trip like this, you have to acknowledge where you're at in it mentally. And that if you recognize that you're not in a good place right now, I'm not saying don't do it, but at least acknowledge it. Because when you're by yourself for a long time, it's really easy to go down rabbit holes very quickly and there's nothing to stop you.
Yeah, in challenging conditions when you've got 15 knots of wind on the nose for 3 days straight and things.
Yeah. Yeah, and that can really get you down. And, there were some days that, I thought about quitting. There were days that I thought about, is it even worth it? Is even anyone gonna care? And oh, hello, Loki.
Trying to crawl onto my lap.
But I think in the end, having people, on knowing that there are people back home counting on me to finish and counting on me to come home, and also being the support network to say, yes, you can do this, is incredibly important. That you might be doing a long distance solo trip, but the solo is you doing it, but that doesn't mean you are alone.
That's a great way to think about that.
That we think of all the, the great adventure heroes of our time, Neil Armstrong, all the big astronauts, or people, sailing around the world, or doing major, cross country hikes or runs like we just had this year. There was a guy that ran across the country in 83 days. All of those people, they did it by themselves, but they were not alone. They had a team, they had a support network.
Yeah.
And so I can't say enough how important it is to have a network before you set out on something like that. So a couple of the questions at the beginning. Are there any other person or adventure story that inspired you? There was definitely a couple of people. So growing up, one of my biggest heroes was Jane Goodall, has been and will continue to be an amazing human being. And even though she's an anthropologist and that she's got that side, but she's become such a great storyteller that she's someone that's been really, I've been viewing as a person to look up towards in how to talk to people. And so I look to a lot of the ways she talks about how to approach conversations and how to deal with conflict and how to deal with differences. But then when it comes to the adventure side, the idea of, adventure storytelling, it's not a very large world in terms of produced content online. But I grew up with, the likes of Steve Irwin and, a lot of the people on Animal Planet's kind of seeing that adventure side. But, now that I'm an adult moving into my own world, a lot of the adventure storytelling is happening on YouTube. And one of the main people that I follow particularly, and it's his whole business around it, is adventure storytelling, is a guy named Levi Allen. He's based out of Vancouver, up in BC, British Columbia. And he has a YouTube channel and also an entire company around adventure storytelling and doing film work for that. But he's been a real inspiration. And then one that a lot of people will know is Jimmy Chin, a photographer, particularly. He's done a lot of work for North Face and Patagonia and National Geographic, big with rock climbing. He's the guy that filmed the documentary Free Solo with Alex Honnold doing what was the
It's El Capitan, right?
yes, El Capitan, without a rope. He's the guy that filmed that. And then in terms of sailing, the big trip that inspired me was the film Maiden Trip, which is the film that follows the girl to do the youngest solo around the world.
Tanya Eby.
Yep. So that was very good, very cool. And then the other thing, we kind of touched on it a little bit of as fate would have it, you started out in March in 2020 and then COVID happened. How did that happen? Like, how did that affect you? Good and bad, actually. That the bad, obviously, is I had mentally prepared myself to be on the water for over 3 months. And that then getting to the point of being prepared for that and then all of a sudden getting yanked off the water after not even 3 weeks was really hard. And so I definitely will admit that, like, I was pretty much in a depression swing for a solid week because I just didn't know. And we were also in the middle of now a pandemic and I just didn't know what to do. But then it also turned into a lot of good things, that it allowed me to reassess a lot of the things within the project, reassess my gear, as well as do a lot of networking of, I had started to build a little bit of a following, which then allowed me to reach out to other people. And I was able to, I started a podcast, which then helped me learn a lot about, audio production and logistics and interviewing. And, I built new relationships, was able to do funding. I built a retail store. So there was a lot of good things that came out of it. And, now on the backside of it, I think the second half of the trip would not have gone as well if I had not had that break. So I try to think of that, kind of that there were some silver linings to getting off the water there.
Anything else you want to talk about?
Let's see.
Can you just distill 107 difficult days down into an hour of discussion? No problem.
Yeah, of course. So one of the other things that you had touched on in the questions here is, what can an average person do to help curb climate change? And I think the biggest thing we can do to curb climate change as a start is just to talk about it. That, by talking about it, that in virtue, we will then start to think about it more. Once we start to think about it more, we will start to care about it more. And once we start to care about it more, we're going to start acting upon it. But we can't start acting upon it if we're not talking about it, beyond just the big, scary, looming thing. But, particularly right now, I think this is actually a really great time to be talking about climate change because we just had the new IPCC report. And that within that report, there, oftentimes there's a lot of climate doomism in these kinds of reports. But they also talked about, there is some hope there, because more than anything is we now have certainty. That there was a great tweet that was running around of a climate scientist that basically said, do I have hope? No. But do you know what I do now have? Certainty. And I think that's a really good way of putting it, that, I try and be hopeful as best I can. And that's what helped get me through a lot of this trip. But certainty is a great place to start, that, this is where we are right now and this is where we can go. and utilizing, what we know now to start a conversation to improve our lives for the better. And that can also start by doing small things, because feedback loops are incredibly powerful. That if you start by, recycling or composting or, volunteering, that, that's not going to make an impact right now, but it changes your mentality and it changes the mentality of the people around you. And the more you do that, the more you're going to start acting upon things, and it just creates a snowball effect. So I think it all just starts by talking about it.
Nice.
Any other ones you want to hit?
Apparently we didn't do a very good job in the script.
There's so many. There's so
I would
many.
say there's a lot. That's like, I could
Yeah.
talk about this for hours.
Yeah.
And so, that's ultimately when I approach these kinds of conversations, like I could talk about anything, like with that, it can be narrowed down to different parts. And so I did end up in the best shape, one of the best shapes of my life by the end of the trip. Not the like ultimate best, because actually I think the best shape of my life was when I worked as a hang gliding instructor out here. But I was in pretty good shape. I was the tannest I've ever been in my life. That's for sure. And I did not do any physical conditioning beforehand. That's for sure. But just like with hiking the Appalachian Trail, your first 2 weeks suck, and then you get used to it pretty quick. And I could definitely tell that particularly if you look at my legs from the beginning of the trip to the end of the trip, there's a noticeable difference. The rest of my body, not really, because I'm not really using my arms that much. So it's really just like from like here down is just much better.
You sat down the entire way. Well, geez.
I know. Honestly, because of that, by the end of the trip, my butt was really sore.
I don't doubt it. Yeah. Yeah.
Like,
and there's a thing called yachty bottom, which is like on boats, you're sitting in water a lot. And so having just a wet butt all the time is not good for you. I'm sure you suffered some from that.
Oh yeah. I think one of the things I'll end on here is, when we talk to people like skeptics, and naysayers and questioners and things like that, and I know you run into this on the Facebook page that you run, Janet, is that when I encounter people like that who are skeptical of climate science or just the whole entirety around that, I always approach it by asking more questions of what about their worldview informs that opinion? Because when people are in that mindset, facts are not going to sway them, at least at that stage. So when I approach people like that, or I encounter people in conversations or interviews, I start by asking questions, trying to understand where they're at, where their worldview is, and what's important to them. And so from there, I start then to figure out where, okay, we don't agree here, but if we go back far enough, where is something we can agree upon? Cool. We both like being on boats. Okay, let's start here. And then we start to work there. Because, actually, I don't know if you guys follow the NPR podcast called Shortwave, which is a daily science podcast from NPR. They just shared an episode they did about misinformation and how to combat that. And it's a really great, like 15-minute episode, and I agree with a lot of it, that to interact with people that don't agree to the same worldview that you have to start at a place where both people feel valued. And if you start that by finding a place of, hey, we both like boats. Cool. Let's talk about boats for a little bit. And then you can start to make your way down to the actual meat of the conversation that you actually want to get to. I found really, really helpful. And it's a skill. And it's something I'm still continuing to work on. I'm not the best at. But I think the more that we focus on those kinds of conversations, the more progress we're going to make, because we're not going to change people's minds by yelling at them. And I'm kind of frustrated of the people on the extreme activism side of just shouting facts into the void and hoping people are going to change their mind, because they're not.
Yeah, I think you're exactly right.
Yeah.
And I agree, it's so hard and it's something that doesn't come naturally. But you get there.
Yeah. And the only way you get better at it is by doing it. So back to what I said earlier, what do? We just need to talk about it.
Well, and if you don't say anything, then the only voices that are heard are people who are spouting misinformation. And so people who are on the fence, who don't know what to think, are like, well, I only ever hear these loud voices.
Yep.
So you kind of have to say something. And I think those people in the middle usually go, oh, wait a second. No, this logical person is correct.
Yeah.
I tend to address those people, like that's my target. Talk to people on the fence.
Yeah, that for social media, public discussions, you have, one or two people who are really vocal on the skeptical side and a lot of others who are not skeptical, but they don't speak up and they're silent. And so only the skeptic's viewpoint gets out there. And as Janet says, when you're responding online to those people, you're not responding, to those people directly. You're actually trying to reach the others who are looking on this conversation, the fence sitters.
That's how I approach it anyways. So we'll get there hopefully. So.
We better.
Yeah, we better.
Yeah.
We better. Well, thank you for your time.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much.